Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with a video to discuss the Vampire Coast and what I think about their balance that are going into the release, and what I've so far what we gleaned from the Ever-Chosen tournament, which was a few days ago, and now we've had some more information and all sorts of stuff released. So I wanted to discuss my thoughts on them and where I think they're going to stand when the patch drops. And to do this, I've also wanted to go over their units and what we know of them and what we know of how capable their units and their combat abilities are. And so there was this cool resource here that I saw on the Steam forums. It was shared by Coco. I don't know if he was the original creator or if someone else was the original creator. Regardless, it is a pretty cool list of most of the unit cards. I do believe this was published after this first day of the Ever-Chosen tournament, so there's not everything is here that was seen on the tournament. Obviously, all the units that were not used in the tournament are not here either. I will try to bring them up and mention them a little bit as we go along, but nonetheless, I do think it's a pretty cool list, and I will be sure to post out a link down in the description below. But without further ado, I do kind of want to go over this roster that we have here first, and then discuss where I think the Vampire Coast is going to stand among all the factions, or how it's going to stand as far as balance goes. So first and foremost, of course, are the infantry. And this faction has a lot of zombie infantry, a lot of variations, and nowhere near all of them are listed here. We've got some of our melee variants, we've got only one of our shooting variants, and yeah, we're missing a lot. But regardless, diving right in, the zombie deckhands mob. This is basically your cheap chaff infantry. We were promised that this would be a cross between swordsmen and skeleton swordsmen, stat-wise. That is nowhere near true based on these stats. they are somewhere between zombies and skeletons. They don't have shields. They have terrible melee stats, even compared to skeleton warriors. I really don't know what they've got going for them, but they're very slow. Basically, they're cannon fodder, though, so it's okay. You bring them to screen out your other units, and they're very useful for that. They do have a polearm variant that we can see here, which does have AP, which is really cool on such a cheap unit. It's probably going to be, I do believe it was referred to having costing like 300. So it's a very cheap and very crappy unit, but it does have AP, which means that it's going to be a threat to anything, including top tier monsters and cavalry, which is pretty cool. It's also worth noting that the Vampire Coast does not have any access to shields, as you can already see here, and if we scroll through the whole list, we can see the same thing. They don't have shields on any of their units, as far as I'm aware. And this does seem to be one of their big weaknesses. It's the fact that none of their units are shielded. They don't have shielded chaff, which is going to make it a little tough, I think, to soak up missile fire. Regardless, they do have a lot of shooting of their own, and unfortunately we've only got one of the unit cards here. There's actually multiple shooting units as far as the roster was as far as the official roster said. Zombie gunnery mob with handguns being one of them, but there's a Free Company styled variant, which we did actually see in the tourney, which can fire on the move, has pistols and swords, and might have better melee stats than these guys who have absolutely god-awful melee stats. There's a shotgun type zombie gunnery mob, and I do believe there's like a grenadier mob, so quite a few different ones. But I do want so definitely a lot of ranged firepower selection, though not a lot of it has good range. Well, none of it basically has good range because they're all black powder weapons. But a few of the cool or interesting things worth mentioning is, well, first of all these infantry units have aquatic, which could be useful in some gimmicky situations on a few maps. Second of all, though, all the shooting for the Vampire Coast has this ability called Extra Powder, which grants plus 30% damage to both explosive and normal projectile, and well, all projectile damage, AP and non-AP, when you're over 80% of your ammo capacity. Which means that for like your first 4 or 5 volleys, depending on the unit, and for most part, you're going to get additional damage, and this could be huge. Oftentimes your shooting will only get 4 or 5 volleys before it's getting shut down or intercepted, so that extra damage could be very useful. However, one of the things that is not listed here is the fact that these guys have very bad accuracy, and I'm not entirely sure if they're intended to have bad accuracy because it's not listed on the card, but in the tournament we got to see them shooting at other units, and the accuracy was god-awful. It doesn't. There's other units that are inaccurate right now. We've got the Orc Airboys, we've got the Bretonnian Bowmen, we've got the Hellstorm Rocket Battery, but of those, only the Hellstorm's really affected. And the situation comes down to arc. On bows, and the arc means that the shots, even if they miss the intended target, are hitting something around that target. So a Bretonnian Peasant Bow is going to do almost as much damage as Empire Crossbows to, say, a unit of infantry, of zombies, of skeleton warriors, whatever. Because any shot that undershoots or overshoots is hitting something else in the unit, essentially. Not always. There will be a few that completely overshoot, but it's not that bad of a big of a difference. But with black powder weapons, because the arc is so flat, basically all the shots that miss are completely whiffing over the head of the target, so they're not doing any damage, or they're hitting the ground. And this seems to be a huge problem. So while the damage output might look great on paper, I doubt that at any respectable range you're going to get more than like 50% of your shots in, possibly even less. So while this might look great on paper, definitely be aware of that. That could be a huge issue for this faction. The simple fact that they're not really able to connect and do a lot of damage at decent range. And getting close to close range to really be able to unload salvo after salvo at point blank is going to be difficult when your speed's at 23. It means you're going to get kited by literally everything. Then we do have our non-zombie infantry. First, the Sartosa Free Company, which is literally Free Company, copy-pasted over. Their HP is the same, which is incredibly disappointing, because Empire State Troops, who are the intended melee units, right, for Empire, have HP in the low 6,000s. These guys have HP at only 5490, so it's literally the same as Free Company. They're basically a Free Company that traded their pistols for a greatsword melee or weapon strength line, by the look of it. And aquatic, I guess, which is honestly kind of sad. They still route like normal human infantry. I don't see them as being that useful because they're going to get shot to death. I think shooting is going to be a huge weakness of this faction, and a unit that routes on top of that is just going to be immediately the easy target. They don't have good leadership, sitting at only 56. I think they're going to be basically never used or very rarely used. They just seem like an incredible letdown, to be quite honest. Maybe if they're really cheap, they could work. But so squishy. And you compare them to Chaos Marauders with great weapons, and I fear that these guys will cost a similar amount but be more expensive. I just don't see these guys being a popular pick. Then we do have Depth Guard, who have two variants. They are your elite top tier infantry. They're pretty interesting. They've got the Hunger and they've got Frenzy. And we don't have the Halberd variant, though we do have the Regiments of Renown listed down below, which we'll touch on a little bit. But basically, one unit is very much a Berserker, offensive-oriented unit, much like Forsaken or Norscan Berserkers or units like that. And these guys can cleave through cheap chaff. This was really shown in the tournament. If they get into melee with infantry, they do amazing damage. That said, I'm not really sold on these guys being that great because their HP is very low and they have no shields. So for a unit that's probably going to cost somewhere in the 1200s to 1300s, if I had to make a guess, they're very squishy to ranged fire. And I could see them getting annihilated by Empire State Troops, by units like handguns, by units like Thunders, by all sorts of that fire. And that could make them really unappealing, unfortunately. The Depth Guard with Halberds, on the other hand, are basically a flip of the stats. They've got much higher melee defense. If we look at the Bloody Reaver deck card here, we can see their melee defense in the 60s with 9 chevrons, so we can expect the 50s normally, which is really high. They're probably going to be around chosen levels of melee defense, and a melee attack probably around 40, so very, very solid melee stats. They do still have the Hunger, and these AP, anti-large, they seem to be very solid, but once again, that susceptibility to ranged I think is going to be huge, and obviously susceptible to getting stomped on by mammoths, which are getting reworked, all sorts of that. The final infantry unit that is not listed here is the Sirens. I don't know what their stats are, and I don't really know how well they might do, but they do. Assuming they're like the Banshees or the Cairn Wraiths, we can assume a speed somewhere between the mid 40s and 60, and probably similar weapon stats and damage output to Cairn Wraiths, which would potentially not be bad for a very immobile roster. Having something that has at least respectable mobility might be surprisingly useful. It's one of those things where for a faction like Vampire Counts that is stellar heavy cav, mobile units or mid mobility units like that are not that appealing. But for a faction that has basically nothing mobility wise, I could see them becoming rather popular. Then we're getting into the monsters, and first, I guess I kind of want to touch, before we get into Monstrous Infantry, I want to touch on some of the redundant stuff. There's Fellbats, and I do believe it's Scurvy Dogs, which are basically your knockoff normal Fellbats and Direwolves. Not much to say there. Basically like their Vampire Count cousins, but with the lack of heavy cav to support them, I could see this being an issue. We'll see. Monstrous Infantry, we do have multiple versions of Monstrous Infantry, or Monstrous Beasts, or whatever you want to call them. Murngulls are the first variant. These guys are very much glass cannon, very low armor, rather bad melee defense, okay HP, but they do have the Hunger, they've got Terror, they've got very high weapons strength, they've got AP and a bonus for infantry. And it's some missile resistance and Vanguard and stock, so they're going to be, I think, a very aggressive, very glass cannon unit, potentially very useful. They could do a lot of hurt, but it is important to keep in mind that they're very slow at only 45 speed. They're definitely not going to be winning any races, and they're probably, I don't know how much the missile resistance is going to be, but they could be very susceptible. Even if they've got decent missile resistance, like say 40 or 50%, I could see them being very susceptible to just getting gunned down by mass non-AP fire, or even AP fire. Then we do have the animated Hulks, which turned out to be a bit different than what I expected. I expected them to be like Chaos Spawn, but apparently they've got AP weapon strength, and very high AP weapon strength at that, so they're a bit more like, I guess, kind of like Trolls. I don't know. I don't really think there's an equivalent unit for them. Very bad melee stats, but supposedly they're very cheap. They're very slow. They've got basically no armor. Their only saving grace is really HP and the high AP damage. But I could see with some buffs or debuffs applied to enemy units, for example, with the Lord ability all the Vampire Coast characters have that debuffs enemy melee defense. I could see these guys getting some good value potentially, especially because they'll be so cheap, where for more expensive Monstrous infantry is easier to focus out, but these guys might be harder to focus out and really shut down. Then the final Monstrous infantry, or pseudo-Monstrous infantry, is the Rotting Prometheans, who have fairly low HP, but they've got very high melee stats. The only one of these units that has really solid melee stats, in my opinion, or melee attack and melee defense. Melee defense of 48 is almost as high as Streetkin. They do have 120 armor. They've got charge defense against large, I do believe. That is, not against all, but they've got AP. They're definitely going to be dishing out, I think, or dealing very well with cavalry, able to sort of soak up cavalry charges. I think these guys are there to act as a sort of speed road bumper, roadblock or speed bumper, roadblock to deal with large targets like cavalry and units like that, by being very tanky, doing some AP damage to be a threat, and having charge defense against large, high mass, that sort of stuff. With their low mobility and high armor, I could see them. I really feel this faction is going to have a lot of issues with ranged. So we'll see how that plays out. But they could be a very useful unit, especially with their high melee stats. Just do keep in mind their model count is lower. It's only at 9. So they're not going to be doing as much damage as, say, animated Hawks or Murngulls, because they just don't have the models for it. Next up, we do have our wannabe Arachnarok. That's literally what the Rotting Leviathan is. Basically, it's basically a Arachnarok spider. Instead of poison missiles on the back, it's got AP missiles on the back. It's unbreakable and healable because it's a undead unit and in an undead faction with lower vampires. But otherwise, it's very much similar to an Arachnarok. Even the stats are pretty akin. I think a lower melee defense, lower melee attack and higher melee defense. But otherwise, pretty similar, I think. No Strider, but it does have an expert charge defense, I do believe. So I think it's going to perform a decent role as a sort of rolling bunker for the faction. And in certain situations, like against Greenskins, ironically, or factions like that, it could definitely do pretty well. There are a few units or a few monsters here that we are once again missing, and I think worth mentioning. We don't know about the bloated corpse. It's not listed here. We don't have any of the artillery or the foot artillery really listed here, so I will try to mention them as we go along, because we did actually see some of them, but I do think it's worth mentioning. And then the final big single monster we have, I suppose, is the Necrofex Colossus, and it's pretty cool. It's like a better Cygor as far as melee stats go, and honestly, you know what? Scratch that. It's basically just a better Cygor. Better speed at 45. It's got 75 armor, which is really nice. Very solid range missile damage, with the benefit of extra powder. It can summon up, I do believe, at least a few casts, I think, of Zombie Deckhands Mob, maybe just one, but it can definitely help defend itself that way. Definitely solid in melee with 42 melee attack, 30 melee defense, no pushover. Better, I think, than a Bone Giant. Definitely better by a lot than a Cygor, which is 44 and I think 14, so very weak in that department. It's got short-range cannons, so definitely can do a lot of work. But if any of you saw the tournament, I do believe it was Gabo King against Aerocrastic. Gabo King's Necrofex Colossus got leveled in like 30 seconds by Empire cannons, so you will definitely want to be a little wary with them when dealing with heavy artillery presence. Once again, I think this faction is going to have some huge, despite having a very powerful artillery presence, I can see them having huge issues with artillery of their own. One monster that's not listed here, well, a few things that aren't listed here. One, the necro effects with the flamethrower that we saw in the trailer. I don't know if that's a Regiment of Renown or if that was just some fancy thing they wanted to show or something for the sake of the trailer, but I still don't know who or if or what has that. But that's not listed here. But the Terrorgeist isn't listed. What we can, however, see if we look down here at Luther Harkon, who's mounted on Terrorgeist in this on the card here, is that the Terrorgeist does not have a bonus versus large. It actually has a normal melee attack of 44, melee defense 42, weapon strength 460. So there's no bonus versus large. Its stats are definitely against large are definitely far worse. Terrorgeist has melee attack at 61, I do believe, against large, whereas this one only has 44. But that will be an interesting change. You're going to have a pretty powerful flyer. I can definitely see the Air Force for this faction being a pretty nasty threat. And the Terrorgeist is going to be more like a dragon with poison rather than being a dedicated large hunter, which currently the Terrorgeist can't really do much to infantry. You have to cycle charge it a lot, and even then it kind of flunks, which is worth keeping in mind. Finally, there are all the weapon teams and artillery and shenanigans like that, which I will try to go over a little bit. 2 units of deck droppers, which are, of course, your flying shooty. They are a bit slower than normal bats. One of them has explosive damage. They throw grenades. Can definitely tear through squishy infantry pretty effectively, but with their short range and low armor, I once again think they're going to struggle against enemy shooting. Deck droppers with handguns are basically like your Raven Heralds, and they seem to be very comparable in their stats, to be quite honest, both missile damage and range. I'm not entirely sure if they're going to be inaccurate too, though, like the foot versions, but definitely potentially pretty potent and pretty annoying unit to deal with, especially for heavy cav, which I think is otherwise going to be strong against this faction. I could definitely see it being an issue having to deal with units like deck droppers harassing you and poking away at you and sniping down your Reichsguard and Emigrifts or whatever. Finally, there are the deck gunner mobs, and the normal artillery and all that stuff, which isn't listed in this collection, but we do have the Shade Wraith Gunners, who are the Regiment of Renown deck gunners. And we can kind of glean a little bit from that. Range 225, so almost to Shopti level. They've got AP missile damage. It's probably going to be a little lower because they're not obviously the normal Regiment of Renown is going to fire slower, but definitely dishing out a decent amount of hurt. Keep in mind these shots pierce, so they're going to be able to punch the holes in the enemy formation, do a lot of work that way. And they've got, I do believe the normal version has Shield Breaker as well, supposedly, so could be pretty potent, could be pretty useful. Definitely one of those things I think worth keeping in mind, that there's going to be a solid artillery core. The cannons and the mortars seem to be literally copycats of their, well, I don't know about the mortars, but the cannons seem to be copycats of the Empire Great Cannon, essentially. So decent accuracy. And they don't have the bad accuracy as far as I saw either. So decent accuracy. They can definitely trade blow for blow with enemy artillery. I don't know how the cost will be, but given that they're undead, the fact that they're going to be unbreakable could be incredibly useful in an artillery duel. Because oftentimes, especially if you're fighting, say, against dwarves, they're going to snipe down your artillery piece of crew and, say, hit it with you with a goblobber, and your crew's going to rout off, which can often be very sad and very annoying. But regardless, that is the collection of artillery. We do also have the Queen Bess, which is a Regiment of Renown artillery piece, which has a huge AoE, kind of like a Hell Cannon. I do believe it fires a lot slower, though. And it has an effect, I do believe, where it has a burn effect to the ground, and it slows all units that it hits by 76%. So, pretty crazy, pretty cool artillery piece with a lot of HP. Definitely kind of psyched to see how it plays out. Should be a lot of fun. And then finally, Heroes and Lords. And quickly going over, we do have the Vampire Fleet Captain, who is basically your generic vampire from the Vampires Younts, but only difference is that you got 30 armor instead of 90, as far as I can tell. Otherwise, basically the same. I don't know if the mounts are different. You do get aquatic, I guess. The big problem I can see is that it's a very probably a very expensive caster, and if you have to, you're forced to bring it by playing with, say, Harkon or someone like that, it could be a bit of an issue. The Vampire Fleet Admiral is your generic lord with a pistol. In this case, you can see she does have a Talisman of Protection, or for the ward save, you've got some spells there, some Lord Vampire stuff. I do believe even if you bring Lord Vampires, you do not get the zombie summon. You always get the zombie deckhand summon instead, which I think Overcast gives you zombie deckhand gunners, just the ones with pistols. That could be wrong. But regardless, Zombie Van Burl, the Vampire Fleet Admiral is basically like the Fleet Captain, but better stats overall. More armor and more weapon strength, melee attack, melee defense, but a pistol tacked on. And if you're able to mount a Terrorgeist or a monster, being able to 360 no-scope people like Witch Hunter is going to be pretty crazy. Morngull Hunter, or Specialist Morngull, is basically just a Morngull roided up a whole bunch. The same hunger, same low armor, same the missile resist, fear, terror, vanguard, stalk, all that good stuff. The main difference worth noting, I think, besides the fact that it's a hero version, is the chill aura, which is going to be slowing people down. Count Noctilus is incredibly tanky on foot, which isn't displayed here because this is his Necrofex Colossus mount. He does have a moon dial that summons infantry. He's got a mix of shadow and vampire magic, as far as I'm aware. Might be a mix of shadow, vampire, and Lord of Deeps, but I'm not entirely sure. He is, however, very tanky. He's got he keeps his hunger even on the Necrofex Colossus, and on foot I believe he has like 110 armor and crazy melee stats, so very hard to kill. Could be very popular, I could see, in a very Vlad-esque manner. And he does have Arcane Conduit, so he's definitely able to cast reasonably well. I can see him being very useful in both his mount and his foot version, so he seems to be a pretty cool lord, and I think he could end up being the go-to for the faction. The Luther was also pretty crazy, and obviously Celestra and Aranessa seem to be pretty solid too, so we'll definitely see. But I know Count Noctilus is probably going to be one of my go-tos. Luther Archon, obviously no magic, but able to mount a Terrorgeist. He does have some cool missile effects, though. He's once again able to 360 no-scope, but he does have an ability that I do believe increases cooldowns, and it increases miscast chance when he's shooting casters, so that's pretty cool. He's got a whole bunch of magic resists and abilities to resist magic, reduce enemy wins of magic generation, all that sort of stuff, so he's a very powerful anti-caster lord. That said, the fact that you're going to have to bring a fleet captain to get some spells could be an issue for people. Definitely would be an issue for me, I think, because if you're forced to pay like 5,000 gold to get a lord in your combo, and then only 7,000 for your army, that's an issue. Also worth noting that both all of the vampire count lords, as far as I'm aware, get or at least Luther Archon, and I think the fleet admirals, get an ability that debuffs enemy melee defense and speed, and I think armor. So it's like a mini Elseef, which is pretty cool. Finally, a handful of Regiments of Renown. We did, I believe, see perhaps one or two others, but I don't recall them from the tournament. The Bloody Reaver deck card seems to be pretty awesome. Regiment of Renown depth card that has the Enrage mechanic, which gives them 44% ward save for 20 seconds, just like the Soul Crusher, which should be pretty awesome. It's a crazy halberd unit by the look of it, but once again, very squishy. Black Spot, Zombie Pirate Gunnery Mob with anti-large, so like a Lothran Seaguard essentially, but they've got AP. Terrible melee stats though, so I don't know how valuable this is going to be. Could depend on cost. They could be pretty good though. A lot of it will depend, I think, on cost for these units, just how good they are. And finally, the Shade Wraith Gunners, who are ethereal deck gunners who do magic damage, and they have the Discouraged effect. I don't know if they lose the Shield Breaker effect, or if that's just been removed from the unit in general, or what the case there may be. But Discouraged with a roster that causes fear and terror in huge quantities could be amazing. Could be very useful. But as you can see, these guys are very squishy, so if you get silver bullets dropped on you, or someone brings a Flag of Sort of Ruin, your day could be ruined very, very quickly with the Shade Wraith Gunners. So, something to keep in mind. Now, as the roster goes, and I do apologize for blitzing through this. I don't want to make this video too long and tedious for you guys. I do apologize, though, if I'm talking a little fast. But as far as the roster goes, I think it's pretty cool that we've got so much black powder in a faction. I do think it's pretty cool that we've got potentially so much damage output, so many buffs, and there's nets from, say, Araness Assault Spite. We've got slows like Celestra's, I think it's in Rapture, what is it, in a Captivating Melody or whatever. I don't know. I forget the name of the spell, but it's a slow. And with some other debuffs applied as well. I could see the damage output going in against, say, Cav or Monstrous could just be crazy. That said, I think the faction's biggest weaknesses are going to be heavy Cav and shooting, and this is actually why I'm saying there it could be a little underpowered when they get released. Because as far as I've seen, the faction has no really reliable ways to deal with enemy skirmishers. Your handgun units, your infantry shooting doesn't have the range, they don't have the speed, and they don't have the accuracy to trade with enemy shooting. Certainly they're unbreakable, they can just keep advancing forever, but when you're 10 speed slower than enemy infantry, everything is going to kite you. An Empire player could just bring a bunch of crossbows backed up by some cavalry and probably be able to keep you off his back forever and just shoot you to death. Certainly there's artillery, certainly there's Necrofex Colossi to try to even the odds, but these can be counteracted by enemy artillery. These won't do that. These don't really tend to do that well against enemy shooting. Maybe mortars, but with no shields to screen yourself against enemy shooting, it could become a really big issue, I could see. And the faction, sorry, I apologize there, but the faction doesn't really have, in my opinion, the greatest tools to zone away enemy cav. And certainly you can try to use your troops like your rotting Prometheans. You can try to use deck bombers to chip away. You use terror guys to flex around, but I don't know if that's really going to work out that well. Generally, you want some units to be able to pin troops down. You want some high mass cav. Skaven suffer the same issue, and they've got similar tools. They've got big single models like the Abomination. They've got Rat Ogres, units like that. They also struggle to stop enemy cav. So I could see that being an issue. These guys do have nets, which is nice. Mainly the shooting, though, I could see being a huge problem, because at least Skaven, who struggle a lot against enemy skirmishers, have decent accuracy at range. And they do have the benefit of shields. They've got a lot of shielded units. They can bring Clanners with shields. They can bring Stormmen with shields. They can bring Lords that buff up shield block chance. Or heroes, I suppose. It's the Doomfire, or not Doomfire Warlock. What is it? The Warlock Engineer. That has an item that gives, I think, plus 12% or shield save. So Skaven can soak up missiles more effectively than this faction, I think. Sure, you might be unbreakable, but unbreakable doesn't help. Your opponent just marches in range and then shells you to death with crossbows or archers, or they high elves, for example. You just bring a bunch of archers and shoot your entire army to death. Throw in a few units to deal with depth guard, and your army isn't going to do very much, I don't think. Even depth guard, honestly, with their 100 armor, it's okay, but you got no missile resist. You only got 5,000 HP. Mass focus fire, good night moon there, you're done. So that's the big problem that I'm seeing with this faction. That's one of the things that really worries me, is their ability to contest the skirmish game, because they just don't have the shield and range combo of the dwarves, who don't have, like, most of their factions have cavalry or mobile options to chase enemy skirmishers. Especially true of the vampire counts, who struggle with this. Factions that don't have those options, though, or Empire, Empire has heavy cav, for example, and artillery. So you can combine the two, you get some synergy there. Faction like Vampire Counts, they've got silver shields, they've got heavy cav. A faction like Dwarves, they've got shields on basically every single unit, they've got very cheap frontline chaff, they've got decent range on their foot shooting, they've got stalked rangers, they've got all this stuff. Skaven are the one faction that struggles hugely in this situation, and they have many of the same weaknesses and much of the same situation as this faction. They've got very short-range foot skirmishers, they've got artillery that's not really ideal for countering enemy skirmishers. Mortars might be better than Blade Claw catapults, but still, I don't know. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work out. And Skaven at least have shields, which this faction doesn't have. So I could see that being a big issue. That's my 2 cents on it, though. I'm pretty hyped for the faction. I do think it's going to be a lot of fun. Definitely excited to see some of the lords and some of the builds people try out. One of the other things I did forget to mention is that Celestra Direfin was shown to lose her ethereal status when she's put on a Leviathan. A lot of people were curious about that. They thought that she might keep her ethereal status. She does not, which makes sense in my opinion, but I know there was a big point of contention before. But regardless, I do thank you all for watching. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it informative. Perhaps you agree with my assessment, perhaps you don't. And regardless, if you'd like to share your opinion, if you'd like to post down below what you think, or how you think the faction is going to play out, be sure to let me know. Be sure to post, and I'll respond as soon as I can. I do thank you all for listening through what was a bit of a long video, and I will be sure to see you all in the next one. Bye for now.